Welcome to the Forest Garden, your guide to transforming your organic gardening practice into an edible forest garden that nourishes the land as much as it nourishes you and your loved ones. On today's episode, we will be jumping right into some of the essential tips and tricks for succeeding in this transformative endeavor. A note for our listeners, this podcast picks up in the middle of a conversation between Ben and myself about my background related to an exposure to permaculture systems when I was in Hawaii visiting my family. Stay tuned and enjoy the episode. Hey there, everyone. Before we officially kick off this episode, we wanted to answer one of the questions posed by one of our podcast listeners. If you were a little confused by any of the topics we discuss on the podcast, feel free to shoot us an email with your question posed as a recorded MP3 file. The email to send the MP3 file to is theforestgardenpodcast@gmail.com. We'd be happy to slide your question in with an appropriate answer into one of our upcoming podcasts, or depending on the amount of questions submitted, potentially we'll release it as an entirely separate Q&A episode. This question comes from Chris, who is based in Manhattan, New York.
Hi Mike, hi Ben. I'd like to know what guerrilla planting is. If I wanted to go plant seeds in public forests or fields, like seeds for raspberry bushes or apple trees, or something you can eat, what are some things I should look into to maintain responsibility for how introducing those plants on public lands can remain environmentally safe?
Really good question. When it comes to guerrilla gardening, I'd say based in a urban area, the number one thing that sort of comes to mind for me is the practice of seed bombing. I'm not sure if our listeners are familiar with this practice, but it's essentially taking some clay, some soil or compost, and a wide menagerie of native seeds and rolling them up into little balls or sometimes larger balls, and then just dispersing them into abandoned lots or areas that are fenced off where there's little growing or not much growing in that area, or it's just entirely covered with what would be perceivably weeds or grasses. In regards to planting in forests or parks, I might advise against that, especially in the city. There's so many spaces that are not cultivated and could be cultivated, such as vacant lots. So areas that have experienced a lot of disturbance recently, disturbance is an area where the soil has been degraded or dug up or tilled, or let's say there was like a construction project that was caught halfway through and didn't finish. Those are the areas to potentially seed bomb. Seed bombing has become popular on TikTok lately and also on YouTube. Somewhat recently, I saw a Vox video about it. Our listeners could definitely check out the Vox video. That one is pretty descriptive. But essentially, all you're doing is you're taking a bunch of native seeds, no invasives, wildflowers, tree seeds, whatever. You're balling it up, throwing it over your shoulder into a vacant lot where there's an area that is pretty disturbed, and then forgetting about it. In that circumstance, so long as you chose entirely native seeds, knowing that they're not particularly invasive, you really don't have to do much in terms of stewardship. You could just go back a year later and see if any of the stuff you threw in there is growing. You know, if you packed a bunch of wildflowers into a ball, the next year, go back, look for those wildflowers, and if they're not there, do it again. That's what I would say to do in terms of guerrilla gardening in urban environments. However, there is another guy out there who's a little bit more ballsy about guerrilla gardening, and he also has a YouTube channel. So this guy's name is Joey Santori. He kind of describes himself as a lowbrow botanist, guerrilla gardener with a really thick Chicago Italian accent, but he's based in LA, and I believe he also has a podcast. His handle is called Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't, so I would definitely check him out. He's a little bit more ballsy when it comes to planting trees and planting shrubs just in public, on public land, and I really respect his vibe. He's got some pretty hilarious YouTube videos out there. So I hope that answers your question, Chris, and to any of our listeners who might have similar questions, please submit them. Well, thanks again, Chris, and I guess we're just gonna jump into the episode now. So let's do it. I'm really interested in tamarillos. My brother-in-law has a few of them, but I didn't know that they could grow in your climate.
Yeah, you have an interesting perspective on all this stuff because you're very steeped in cold climate plants and cold climate forest gardening, but your family has land in Hawaii and you've gone out there and you know about these plants, these tropical forest gardening plants as well.
Yeah, and I wish I knew more. Or well, I in the past when I've gone out, it's just sort of been like, oh yeah, here's like this mame sapote, and I'm like, oh cool, what does it taste like? Or like, here's this ice cream bean. I had there's at no point did I have any understanding of agroforestry and intercropping, row cropping, or all of the things that I am interested in now. It's like I feel like I should go back to my sister's farm to sort of better understand the landscape because
Me with you.
my brother-in-law, or sorry, what were you going to say?
Take me with you.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go to
no,
Hawaii.
for sure. No, dude, you're welcome to come. The situation over there on Big Island, the problem is that they have so many more like pests and issues and problems that are just constantly occurring compared to cold climates. And I'm not sure if that's actually talked about in agroforestry classes enough. I mean, not that I've taken any, but I guess that'd be a question for you. But like, Eric has some hand in the Yale agroforestry thing, and it'd be interesting to see if they address cold climate pests versus tropical pests, because in the tropics there's just way more stuff to deal with. You have to deal with wild boar digging up your $10,000 worth of fruit trees that you planted versus here in the East Coast in a zone 6 climate. It's like we have to deal with voles. It's
Sure.
totally different. We don't have fire ants. Fire ants are like the super species that could like take over the world that my sister is battling every day, and we just have it so easy by comparison.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I think most of the curriculum or discussion on agroforestry and to a lesser extent permaculture focuses more on like the overarching design characteristics and the way it differs from maybe other approaches, and with the understanding that you can kind of plug in any tactic of trying to avoid certain diseases or deal with certain pests. But I mean, I think the discussion is there for things like attracting ecologies and building ecologies to kind of help prevent these things from happening in the first place, like barriers and shelter belts. Shelter belts are usually talked about for windbreaks, but also hedgerows that are thorny that can keep out deer. And if you're in Hawaii, maybe boar. I don't know if boars would be stopped by blackberries and
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I feel like they would just
yeah.
mow right through it.
Well, so I guess we should start this episode.
Well, I mean, you were forest gardening well before I even knew anything about any of this. I mean, even some of the videos that you have on your platform, for example, like the Oenanthe one, with the water celery, I just copied you and just ordered some water celery from someone on Etsy and planted them in a place where I'm hoping they'll take over and become a ground cover. So thank you for that. I thought of a few things as the basics. And the first thing I just thought about was cultivating diversity. But why don't you go first with whatever you would like to touch on, and then we'll just go back and forth.
Sure. Yeah, we can kind of alternate. So I kind of kept with a theme for my 3 tips for establishing a forest garden. And the theme is kind of stacking. So talking about spatial stacking, temporal stacking, ecological stacking. And that's probably where we'll overlap a little bit if we're talking about diversity. I think one of the unique things about forest gardens is that they include various layers. And not every forest garden needs to have the full 7 layers. You can have less than that. You could have 2, 3. The big thing is that you're not just doing one crop, one monoculture. And also you're not just doing one layer. So you could have multiple crops and not be doing you could be doing a polyculture. But if you're just in one layer, you're just doing a herbaceous layer of vegetables and strawberries or something like that in your garden, that wouldn't necessarily be a forest garden. I think one of the distinguishing factors is the spatial stacking. So using the 7 layers. The way I think about it is using multiple dimensions, not just the 2 dimensions on the ground, but 3-dimensional space. So the vertical space. And so an easy way to conceptualize this is vines on trees. And it's a tactic that's used often in the tropics and tropical forest gardens, but we can do that here in the colder climates. We might have people listening from all over, hopefully, but if you are in the colder climates, there's less resources available. So we can kind of focus there for right now. Vines on trees is a great tactic because you can, from literally a square foot footprint on the ground, you could have so much surface area available for a vine to grow. So something like maypop or akebia or there's a lot. And there's even you can even do annual vines. There are a couple different things to consider though when you're going to put a vine on a tree. Is one, you don't want to use a tree that's too young or too vulnerable. It has to be able to withstand, a vine sort of taking over. So it has to be an established tree. And you want to make sure that it's not going to be vulnerable to the competition that whatever you plant around it is going to create. So I won't harp too much on the specific details of that, but just this idea of using 3-dimensional space, whether that's a wall, whether that's a trellis, whether that's a tree, is a really good way to start thinking, just starting to put those forest gardening goggles on to understand, all right, well, how can I maximize the efficiency of my space? Because forest gardening, multi-strata agroforestry is supposed to be really efficient. And that's something that I think is very easy for people to do.
It's interesting about the trees and the vines, because I've been hesitant to plant these, kiwi, arguta, or kolomatka, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, on these established trees that I have, with a fear that they'll just completely kill the tree. But I guess if they are, really established 100-year-old, 50-year-old trees, you're right in that they can't do too much damage, probably.
Sure.
But also,
or they could.
Have you tasted a kiwi? Or they could, yeah, and that's my, who knows? And I've been told be a little wary with those kiwi vines. Put them in places you don't want them to, completely decimate everything else that you're binding up. Have you tasted a Akebia crenata?
Yes.
A chocolate vine? And
what
does it taste? Is it good?
I was growing them for years and years in Nashville, but never got any fruit until the very last year. And I had to move away before it actually ripened, sadly. But then I went to a botanic garden here in Missouri, and they had it's amazing botanic garden. Yeah, they had this one trellised area that had 5 different species of Akebia and full fruiting. So I took a bunch. I might have picked them a little too early, but I split them open, and they're just these wild looking things with bright white flesh with dark black seeds. Looks almost like a dragon fruit, but the seeds are really big. And when I tasted it looks like a banana. That's what the fruit itself kind of looks like. Anyway, you rip it open and eat the flesh on the inside, and it's not super flavorful, at least the one that I had. So I wasn't totally impressed, but I'm waiting to try a more ripe one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I wasn't sure if it was you who told me that, is that you tried Akebia and you're like, I'm not sure, I'm not so sure about it. But if it wasn't you, I had a different friend who told me, and was just sort of I wasn't overly impressed. I'm not sure if that's something I really want to cultivate. And so for that reason alone, it's one of the things on my list of hold off on planting this, because it might not be worth having it take over.
But I think that's a good rule to have, is before you devote years to planting out things and interesting species, maybe see if you like it first, if that's possible.
And so that's actually something I made a note about, which is that about the whole cultivating diversity idea, which is basically the whole purpose of having a forest garden. It's even in the worst case scenario where you don't like that thing, at the end of the day, it's still adding diversity to your landscape. So it's not the worst case if you do that, if you cultivate something and it doesn't end up tasting good. But yeah, I definitely did way too much with the plant first and taste later. And I imagine I'm going to be ripping a lot of things out in 5 years. But anyways, I interrupted you. You were on a really great, I'd like to go back to whatever you were running on.
About vertical space and spatial stacking. Kind of a common design principle for landscaping and also permaculture design and forest garden design is you want to have the taller elements to the north or northwest, because, and there are exceptions to this rule, but if you're in the northern hemisphere, at least your sun, most of your solar radiation is coming from the south in the spring and fall, and of course from in the winter as well. It's all coming with an orientation from the south. If you have your trees and tall shrubs, tall herbaceous things like Jerusalem artichokes, whatever's growing really tall and up there, if you have that on the south side, it's kind of obvious it's going to shade out a lot of your forest garden, and maybe that's what you want, but if possible, you should be planting or positioning your forest garden so that the taller elements are more towards the north or the northwest. And I say northwest because at the end of the day, when the temperatures are higher, when the sun is more in the western part of the sky, a little bit of shade is kind of nice for some of the plants so that they don't kind of overheat. That's a good way to kind of think about it as you're positioning your vertical elements in the system and the spatial stacking. And then, let's not only think of up, let's also think down. Let's think ground covers. If you have your garden of, maybe you have annual vegetables, maybe they're perennial vegetables, great, or fruit trees, or even shrubs, there's a lot of unused space that's underneath that you could be growing, and it's not going to compete at all if you have low growing vegetables and fruits and herbs, or even just ecosystem plants or other elements. Trying to think really low to the ground, like what can I do to reduce that weed pressure to basically fill that ecological niche that if you don't fill it, something else is going to fill. So hopefully you can fill it with something that's useful to you or useful to the bugs or insects or birds, animals, whatever you're trying to attract. So you could be using sweet potato or water celery or Chinese artichoke, the Stachys genus. I can't remember. I think that's Krosny's. I can't quite remember the other common name.
Yeah, and I've heard that and I pronounce them Krosny's too, but I've heard they're pronounced Crohn's, which is weird. And while I've already cut it, I don't know if that's right, but pronunciations of common names and everything. On the J chokes or the sunchokes, one sort of interesting note that I made when I visited Jonathan Bates' property in upstate New York is that he had a bunch of Clearwater Jerusalem artichokes planted on the north side of a barn, which is what I replicated on my property. And I would have never thought to do that, but they, grow tall enough. And it's like what you were saying, you don't want them to shade out everything if you plant them on the south side. So planting them on the north side of a barn, they grow 12 feet tall. They're able to reach out and get the sun for most of the day. And they were doing just fine there. They were very happy in a complete full shade location for most things, but not for sunchokes.
Oh, I just saw a hummingbird fly by. It's the first of the season. Okay. And then the last point on the spatial stacking is something that I probably need to learn more about, but the basic idea is the underground stacking. So really thinking about spatially, what are the roots of the different plants that you're planting? What are the root patterns? Is it a tap root? Is it a heart root? Is it like a net shaped roots that travel along the surface? Just like feeder roots within the top couple centimeters of the soil. And the idea is that you don't want to be planting plants that are trying to use similar soil horizons. And so a good way to do this is if you have taprooted trees like persimmon or pawpaw or black walnut, it's more likely that they're going to be taking up nutrients and water using that taproot and maybe relying a little bit less on the surface roots. So you might be able to get away with planting them a little bit closer to shrubs or other gardens, as opposed to planting next to trees or shrubs that have more net roots. And the same thing goes for like your annual vegetables, like planting carrots next to lettuce, because those things have very different fruit shape patterns. So they're not going to interfere with each other. So that's just, another point to consider: the vertical space, the two-dimensional ground area space, and then the underground stacking as well. All right, I'll hand it off to you now, Mike.
One thing that, I definitely also need to think more about the underground layer as well. I've never considered the fact that, persimmons and pawpaws have that taproot, because the only way that I'm thinking about underground stacking or spatial stacking is in the opposite, where you use dynamic accumulators that send down a really deep taproot, and they don't interfere with trees that usually send out deciduous trees of whatever nature, whatever like any sort of deciduous tree that sends out its roots and kind of just stay in the top few inches of soil in the subsoil layer. But I've never thought about the opposite, so that's really interesting. We didn't totally explain the 7 layers of the food forest, and it like diligently, and I don't know if we necessarily need to do that. But one of the most important layers that a lot of people overlook is fungi. And it was, once again, your video on King Stropharia mushroom propagation that got me into to order a whole slew of starter kits, I guess the way to put it, of sawdust spawn, and just propagate. And I also ordered a bunch of wood chips, and I started propagating all over my property. But that's just something that a lot of people completely overlook in their forest gardens or the regular gardens, is the benefits of mycelium.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of brings me to my first point of any, if I was going to relate to anyone who wants to start out a forest garden on their property in the most basic, simple terms, it's just like mulch. Like, you need to go out and you need to find a lot of material, quote unquote, brown material, to mulch your forest garden with. And for me, that could be fall leaves. People don't recognize in America how important
Yes.
ground covering soil, bare soil. When you go to like a community garden, you see all the garden beds laid out, and there's no mulch anywhere. No, there might be mulch in the pathways, but the raised beds or the areas that are being cultivated are never covered with mulch. And that is the most stupid thing. I just, it's something that I'm just coming to realize basically in the past year, how important mulch is. But it's so important. We need to, instead of blowing our leaves into our neighbor's lawn or chopping them up and putting them in a bag and having the city come pick them up, we need to start putting them in our gardens. Which is something that people need to start doing all the time.
It's such a cheap,
it's free. It's nature's ground cover.
I've been using
similarly.
I've been exploring a new technique this year, which jury's still out, but I'm doubling down, tripling down on this mulching technique this year, both for what you're talking about, mycelium, to kind of improve that layer, but both fungi and bacterial. And maybe for this solution, it's more bacterial, but is lawn clippings. So I've got the house that I'm in right now has a pretty large lawn, and I'm renting at this point in time, and I put in as much gardens as I can handle with my school workload right now, but there's still plenty of extra lawn that I've got to mow. I bag it all up and I use it as mulch on all my garden beds. And I did it the same thing last year, and it's breaking down into this really great mulch. And I was planting in it earlier today, and there's worms just like crawling throughout this entire pile of lawn mulch. And so it's a very cheap solution to keeping the water in, keeping the weed pressure down. But yeah, wood chips are great too. It's a great soil builder. It takes a couple of years to fully break down, but hey, that's kind of what you want. You want your mulch to stick around if you can.
And that's that. Thank you for this incredible segue, Ben Bishop. No, what I was going to say is that in terms of wood chips, which a lot of people have a particular opinion about what kind of mulch they like to use best. Some people like to use fall leaves, and some people like to use wood chips. People say that wood chips take too long to break down. I am a huge advocate for pine wood chips. Everyone hates on pine because it breaks down faster. It's not hardwood. That is perfect for the forest garden. That is perfect for my hugel beds. That's perfect for my garden beds. I want something that's going to break down at a reasonable rate and not take 3 to 4 years to break down. And another thing is that people don't consider is that when you get that load dumped off from your forestry service of whatever trees they cut down that day, which usually is a decent amount of pine mixed with some hardwood, there's a incredible amount of green material mixed in from any pine tree that's been cut down, especially if it's in the summer, that could be from a deciduous tree also. But at this time of year in the spring, pine is great because the ratio that gets dumped off in your lawn of greens to browns in that pile is like the perfect composting ratio of like mostly browns and some green pine. It's perfect. I could not, I will frequently just put my little spade into a pile or like on top of my hugel and just see what's going on down there. And I'm tempted just to start planting things directly into it without soil and see how it does.
Sorry to interrupt you, but have you looked into the pH at all? I've heard that pine mulch is pretty much fine, but I've heard other rumors of pine mulch changing the pH of the soil. Do you know anything about that?
So I've heard that. I've heard that also. And basically, from what I understand, it's that so long as the little, pine, as long as the greens of the pine tree are not like mixed in a mass quantity directly into the soil, I guess it really doesn't acidify the soil that much. If you have your soil layer and then it's covered with a layer of all pine needles and then wood chips and then wood chips and pine needles all mixed together, or just pine needles and wood chips mixed together, the result apparently is not any amount of acidification of your soil that is notable. Once again, I don't know how much testing has been done on this, but I think it's more of a garden rumor or, a myth of the garden world that it is going to raise the acidity of your soil by like a notable amount. And also, I mean, I was hoping that it would acidify my soil because I was building hugel beds that all of the wood chips was going to get put on top of. And I wanted the compost that I got from the town, which usually has a pretty alkaline pH, to be lowered. So if it did acidify it, it would benefit to me. But I guess we'll see. I haven't done any soil tests, and it's basically because I feel like it's too soon. Everything that's going on in my hugels is just, they haven't really even started up yet. So in probably like 6 months, I'll take a soil test.
So back to the idea of mycelium and incorporating mushrooms into forest gardening. What are the other benefits just to having a healthy mycelium community, a fungi community throughout the forest garden? What other benefits would you say there are to that?
Well, so there's a lot to be learned about the connections that trees have with each other through the mycelial network. And I recently watched Paul Stamets' documentary about mycelium, which was mind-blowing. I would say that besides the benefits that the plants have through each other, benefiting from that mycelial network that we can try to create in our systems, because essentially as forest gardeners, we're trying to replicate forests. The biggest benefit is being able to eat the mushrooms. Those King Stropharia mushrooms are delicious, and I can't wait until they start popping up. And as a society, we just kind of take mushrooms for granted. We see them, and a lot of people don't even like mushrooms, but let's say the people who do, we go to the store and like we just buy the pre-cut shiitakes or whatever, and don't recognize that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time for those mushrooms to be created, especially in like a natural setting and not inside of a complete, like basically a vacuum, inside of the labs that they're created in, which those labs are super cool. But, in our setting where we're trying to grow them in wood chips, getting a flush is a pretty exciting moment.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Adding that, yeah, and I'm saying that I haven't even gotten a flush yet. I'm just like thinking of the day it happens. Overall, like besides the taste and enjoying the mushroom that you grew in your backyard, I would say that it's just the most overlooked part of the whole forest gardening system. People often look at the shrubs and are like, oh, I want to plant raspberries. I'm going to get some currants for the shady areas of my lawn. I'm so excited to make currant wine, which is equally as exciting as mushrooms, I guess. But basically, the last thing that people are thinking about is the mushroom layer, and we need to spend a lot more time devoting ourselves to cultivating mushrooms all over the place, because they do an incredible amount of work for us that we don't even recognize. It's like people's appreciation for bees. We have very little appreciation for all the work that bees do,
Well,
and without them we'd be hand pollinating everything.
It's funny that you mentioned bees. I was just thinking of ecosystem wise, ecology wise, the by incorporating another kingdom, fungi come from another kingdom, you're creating this edge between the plant kingdom and the mushroom kingdom and the fungi kingdom. And that's in permaculture, we talk a lot about edge and trying to maximize the amount of edge that we have in the system, because that's where a lot of exchange happens biologically. And there's some advantages to be gained there. And I was reminded with bees, honeybees in particular, Paul Stamets has a study that he did, or an observation that he had with honeybees using, I think it might have been a King Stropharia, like a wood chip patch, and they were visiting it in an unusual amount, and they were gathering up some of the metabolites, those kind of like little droplets that come out of mycelial networks. And he did some studies, and I'm not very researched in this area, but what I remember is that they were using it because there was an affliction with a virus or some other pathogen in the hive, and there were some metabolites in the mushrooms that were able to counteract or denature the virus in some way. And so there was this like innate wisdom of the honeybees to visit and find and seek out this mycelium to get those metabolites. So just all these, like you're saying, all these different interactions that you don't even know about, you might not even notice, but incorporating as much diversity from the plant kingdom, from insects, from mushrooms, can really just stabilize the system and balance it out as a whole.
Yeah, and I saw that exact bit where he was mentioning I'm trying to rack my brain. I feel like if it wasn't King Stropharia, it might have been like turkey tail, but yeah, I think it was King Stropharia. And that is another thing. It just blew my mind that the honeybees just already have this like, built into the structure of their society to know that when there's a sickness, we go and find the fungus that like fixes everything. It's just crazy to me to think about that. It's mind-boggling. And you kind of brought me on to my next point of my little notes here, is basically the idea of borders. Forest gardens, and permaculture really focuses on the importance of edges. That was one of the first things in my property that I tried to focus on, is sort of the areas that were neglected or not used, were non-functional. Nobody really walked on them or visited them, because soil compaction is something to consider whenever you're designing a landscape, is how frequently does someone walk here. And the areas of the property that were visited the least also ended up sort of being some of the most beneficial places to create new systems of design. So all of the edges of the woodland, like swamp zone, along the established lawn, were kind of the first places that I started planting things. And a lot of people think that you can't plant anything in dry shade or in any shade, full shade. They just think, oh, like nothing can go there except maybe hostas. And that's just simply not true. You can plant a lot of things in full shade and get a pretty decent yield from those plants that, you can't get that from annual vegetables, which is probably the reason why most people think that you can't plant anything in full shade. And in part shade, you can do so many perennial vegetables and perennial shrubs, but in full shade, you can plant haskaps, you can plant black raspberries, blackberries, currants. Generally, black currants I feel like do best. Red currants have planted red, golden, black, pink, and we'll see how, and a variety of different places, we'll see how they all do. From what I've read and seen, it seems like the black currants do best, and then red does okay. And then depending, on a variety of factors, they can produce more or less throughout the season. And I guess that also just, more than just depending on the borders or the edges of your property and thinking about places to cultivate diversity, it's also to really value shade. Shade is something that has really been overlooked as, somewhere that we can really, really dig into and think about all of the different layers of the forest garden that work in full shade. So I think we've talked about this a little bit, but basically recently I was thinking, okay, so I have this area in full shade. It's on the border, it's on the north side of a tree line. So I'm going to plant a bunch of currants here of all different varieties. And then now what? What do I do next? And so what sort of perennial vegetables work here or what sort of ground covers work here. And then as I started researching, there was a vast array of ground covers that love full shade. Sweet woodruff is the ground cover that I ended up choosing for that area. It's used for, I think, teas. It's edible. It kind of has like a flavor similar to vanilla, I guess. I haven't tried it yet, but sweet woodruff is a beautiful edible medicinal ground cover that I ended up integrating into that area. I just think that in general, people need to start recognizing that shady borders are way more valuable than we give them credit for.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a shift of perspective from, hey, how can I make this plant grow in this microclimate or in this part of my yard or this edge? And more about, hey, what is growing naturally in this area, or what would grow naturally in this area if there were seeds, if there were materials for it to grow, and learning and adjusting our own lifestyle to try out these new herbs and vegetables and fruits and kind of expand our palate a little bit. So I think that's another way to perceive it, as opposed to forcing, an idea that you have. I want to grow tomatoes in a shady part of my forest garden. It's like, nope, it's not going to work. But there's plenty of other things you can do.
And let's come up with like the 10 other high-tech devices that are going to make this happen. We're going to come up with like a tree tower system of hydroponics and like under lighting. Like it's all going to work out. Yeah, that stuff's crazy. It occurred to me, rhubarb is the other plant I was trying to think of. Is a vegetable that is overlooked as a great vegetable for, I don't know about full shade, but definitely partial shade. And the reason being is, like you were saying, like the layers and stacking. Rhubarb leafs out and grows super early in the season, well before deciduous trees leaf out. So you can plant rhubarb in a forest garden setting, and it will grow during April when the sun is full, hot. There's no leaves to, diffuse any of the light. It'll just absorb all of the nutrients from the sun and grow to its full size, and then hold its size for the whole season. And that's, I don't know of many other vegetables that, I mean, I guess fuki, but like, there's not too many other perennial vegetables I can think of that sort of fulfill that same sort of idea or that same sort of function in the perennial food forest system. And that's something that just sort of occurred to me recently, looking at my rhubarb plant and being like, you grew to your full size before any of these trees have leafed out at all. And this is something I need to take more advantage of. So I guess I'm going to start planting a lot of rhubarb in shade and see how it goes.
And it's kind of funny. It's almost like you're in the room with me, because like the next thing I wanted to talk about, I've got like a little like note guide here, was the idea of temporal stacking. So looking, throughout the season, early, mid, late, and really thinking about, is there canopy shade that's going to interfere with the needs of this plant and vice versa? So, but did you have something to finish that off with?
No, you should. This is a great segue. You should go with it.
I heard you starting to talk about it, and I was like, oh yes, this is like a nice. This is going very smoothly. Yeah. So I mean, this idea of like where you're going to place, especially perennial plants, where you kind of have to decide pretty clearly where you want them to be. It's helpful to kind of think, okay, maybe these can be planted close together because they require light at different parts of the year. So you have like the spring ephemerals. And I don't know if you call rhubarb a spring ephemeral necessarily, but it's an early crop. It's an early plant that will leaf out and absorb a lot of that light early before the trees leaf out. So nature is a great way to look at this. Like if you go out hiking right now, we're in late April. And even like a couple of weeks ago, you go out hiking and the overstory is pretty much bare here in Missouri. And then the understory is popping out. Understory, there's plenty of green growth happening with the small shrubs and the herbaceous layers. And we can kind of imitate that in forest gardens and say, okay, well, we can plant plenty of things in the shade around our trees, but we have to be careful to choose the plants that are going to not need most of their light later in the season, mid in the season, and need more light early in the season. So you mentioned rhubarb. I mean, some people grow ramps, but really any spring onion would be a great choice for that, because they can come out and they'll be shaded in the summer when they don't like a lot of sun anyway. I've recently tried for the first time this year toothwort, which is a really cool wild plant that you can incorporate into your gardens that tastes just like wasabi. It's pretty wild. I didn't even try the root. I just tried the leaves, and the leaves taste just like wasabi. And they're a pretty high end plant for restaurants too. So if you can get like a local wasabi flavor to your local chefs, I mean, it's a great plant to have for yourself and for your community. But that's something that leaps out and is harvestable early in the season. So basically the idea I wanted to bring up was just temporal stacking, thinking about having different yields in the early and mid and late seasons. And one way for species selection, looking at which tree species you want to use. If you're looking at nuts, I work pretty heavily with black walnut. Black walnut's a very late leafing nut tree. It's one of the latest in this region. Most of the trees have already started to leaf out, but there's still black walnut trees in the area that are going to take another month to start up. And so that creates a great window in forest gardens for a lot of sun infiltration and growth and harvest. And even before the trees have leafed out, chestnut is another good choice for this as well. It's another late leafing tree species.
So before we get to, do you know what happened to the hardiness zone on the toothwort? Is that something I could be growing as well?
I believe it should be hardy to Connecticut.
The other thing in regards to the temporal stacking is asparagus and tomatoes. That's something that I've decided to do. You did the asparagus and the strawberry situation. Mm-hmm. So the asparagus comes up well before any of the annual crops that you can have, and the beneficials between asparagus and tomatoes really like each other. So I have a row of asparagus growing next to our normal setup for tomatoes.
Oh, that's great. And I bet that those kind of like feathery leaves that asparagus has don't really interfere later in the season with the tomatoes. In fact, they might, if they do shade out any sort of, if they do create any shade for the tomatoes, it might actually be very light and sparse and might even be welcomed in the hottest parts of the summer.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. You were saying chestnut?
Oh yeah. So the last idea for this idea of temporal stacking that I wanted to throw out there is basically thinking about this idea of diversity, even within species, even within the same plant that you're growing. Different. Again, I'll go back to black walnut because that's what I'm studying right now for my master's degree. Even within the species, there's a really wide range of phenology when ones will leaf out, but then also when they're harvested. If you want to eat from your garden as much as possible, well, you don't want all your tomatoes, all your walnuts, all of your asparagus, whatever it is, coming in at the exact same time. Because, if you like fermentation and food preservation, yeah, that's great. You can just batch it all up. I like doing that a little bit, but I also like eating things from my garden fresh. So I want to have a steady supply. So one thing to do is include a lot of cultivars, a lot of different and seedlings as well, and not having the same variety, the same clone of something multiplied across the whole garden. You want to have variety in the cultivars within the species that you're using. I know you've been experimenting with grafting, having on the same tree multiple different cultivars of, I think it's peach, and that can be replicated just on many different woody species, but also just in the selection of the plants you grow. Maybe instead of, I was going to say Jerusalem artichoke, but maybe that's not the best example. But pick your vegetable or fruit. Instead of growing one type, grow 8, or maybe just 2, 3, more than just one.
That is wisdom. No, and also just the idea of aiming for plants that have multiple uses. So having a majority of plants that they don't just do one thing for you, but they do several. So in my hugel mounds, I decided that I wanted to have lupines as my nitrogen fixers, but lupines are also beautiful. So they're highly ornamental. Mm-hmm. And they also are pollinator attractors, beneficial attractors. Similarly, I decided that I wanted to have yarrow all up and down the hugel mounds, and they attract tons of beneficial insects for specifically brassicas. And as you know, I'm a big brassica nerd.
Yes.
And basically they are interplanted with all of the perennial kales from the Chrysomanix gene pool that hopefully the yarrow will be defending my perennial kales from all sorts of pests that we have here on the East Coast. Also, aside from being a beneficial attractor and also a beautiful plant, it's also used to make tea, which I didn't know about up until recently until I read this book, Wild Food, and I'm very excited
Never heard
to
of
try
that.
it out this summer. Same thing with, yeah, I never heard of it either. And same thing with dill. I mean,
Hmm.
self-seeding annual.
It's
Yes.
funny. Once again, you're
Yeah.
like you're following the exact train of thought that I have here. Moving on to ecological stacking, but yes, still is it, a Queen Anne's Light
Yeah. And
bomb is also great for attracting those parasitoid braconid wasps.
yeah, the parasitoid wasp. It's, I mean, another thing that we haven't talked about yet is self-seeding annuals and the benefit that they can add to your forest garden. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, dill I think of as the easiest explanation to someone in terms of interplanting and having diversity in your garden. Because let's say that you have cucumbers or any sort of brassica, and they're covered with cabbage worms. Instead of having to spray them constantly with whatever things you probably don't want to be spraying on your food, you could be planting dill, and dill can then be later, aside from being pretty and being tasty, you can also use it with the cucumbers that it's defending, quote unquote, to make pickles, which I did all summer long. And I had probably, have you ever made refrigerator pickles?
Sure. Yeah. Delicious.
And I was also growing a bunch of peppers or hot peppers, and oh my god, like homemade pickles versus store-bought pickles, it's just like night and day. So it's just like thinking of all these different stacking uses of plants and coming up with plants that have multiple uses to benefit not only your garden, but then they end up feeding you, and the food is so much better than any other of the alternatives. It's something I wish I'd been doing a lot sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very reaffirming to see your garden kind of come to life with lots of different pollinators and ecosystems starting to form, whether that's honeybees or hummingbirds or parasitoid wasps. Like seeing life get attracted to your garden is just it's wonderful. It's almost as good as like the food that you're getting to. There's just some sort of, I don't know, maybe it's a spiritual connection just to see all this life become generated by the plants that you put in the ground, or just the nature that you let kind of retake that land. And it's just nice to sit back and watch it happen.
For sure. So your third point.
Third point.
Ecological stacking? Ecological.
It's basically what we're talking about right now, but I'll kind of quantify it a bit more. So this idea of having ecosystem or plants that support the ecosystem that are active throughout the entire season. So let's talk about, we've already covered parasitoid wasps, but let's talk about nectary plants. So, honeybees and other pollinators benefit from having plants throughout the season from early spring to late fall in bloom as much as possible to provide nectar and energy for them to survive. And so it kind of behooves us as forest garden designers to make sure that there's something in bloom, the entire length of the season as much as possible. There are a great number of charts online where you can look into the seasonality of various flowers and plants that you put in your garden. By including a large number of genera and different types of plants, you're probably going to get a lot. And at a certain number, if you're putting in, like we do, Mike, like hundreds of types of plants into our forest garden, that will probably cover most of our bases. Like maybe we'll have to throw in a couple really early bloomers or really late bloomers to make sure that there's nectar sources for those times. But pretty much it's easy to find something in bloom throughout the summer. But one kind of helpful tip that I'll throw out for people, because I want to provide as much value as possible. I learned this from it's another podcast out there. It's called like the Native Plant Podcast. And they recommend 3 native plants native to probably the Southeast or the eastern part of the US, that if you have these 3 native plants, you will have nectar sources and pollinators in your garden pretty much throughout the whole year. You'll have your bases covered. And those are wild quinine and the mountain mints, which I've grown before, and I can attest that I've counted like 10 different species of pollinators at the same time on my mountain mint plants. It's ridiculous. The Pycnanthium species or Pycnanthium genus. And then the last one is boneset. And I can't quite recall the species on that. I think it's like Parthenum integrifolium or something like that. If you have those three, you'll have your bases covered for nectary sources. That's for just sheer energy for the pollinators. But then also, like we were talking about, like you mentioned, the small flowers. So like parasitoid wasps don't have really long tongues like other pollinators do. So they need short flowers, shallow flowers, like the umbels, that are going to allow them to take their nectar. So making sure you have a variety of those in your plants, your plant selection is great. And then also host plants for invertebrate caterpillars. So, if you walk around a forest garden, you should be seeing holes and bites in all of the leaves of your plants, because if there's no bites, there's no holes in the leaves, that means the plants aren't participating in the ecosystem. And that means they're not, feeding something. You want everything to be feeding something else in a forest garden. Choosing plants that are host plants for invertebrate caterpillars, for the Lepidoptera species are the main one that's looked at, because those caterpillars are going to feed birds. Those caterpillars are going to feed amphibians or other predatory insects. So they're the backbone of an ecosystem. Doug Tallamy says that the best tree species, because trees are going to really feed and again be the backbone of your ecosystem. So the best tree species for basically allowing these insects to feed on the leaves are oaks. Oaks are probably one of the best trees to include in a forest garden, both for the acorns for us or for animals, but also the leaves are really great for those caterpillars. So oaks, the Prunus genus, so your black cherry or Prunus serratina, which, great, we can get black cherries off of it. It's delicious. Choke cherries, Prunus virginiana, I believe, and then American plum, Prunus americana. And then the last thing I'll mention about this idea of like really trying to pack in as much ecology as possible is just physically shaping your forest garden through piles of rocks, mulch, like we talked about, lots of cover, moist areas, dry areas, lots of variation in the type of terrain that you have that's going to really be able to attract amphibians, birds, insects, and really help them create a habitat in your garden. Like sometimes you don't want every type of wildlife in your garden if there are some pests, but overall you want to balance. So, even just attracting a toad to your gardens can really help. I mean, one toad could eat thousands of sow bugs, however you want to call them, and slugs in a single season. So really trying to think about, does my forest garden have blue-tailed skinks and toads or frogs or lizards, whatever your climate dictates, and trying to include as many different, again, all these edges, all these different genera and families of ecology.
So it's funny that you mentioned pile of rocks, because something that I've recently considered doing is incorporating rock walls. Something I've recently considered doing is incorporating rock walls or piles of rocks in my forest garden to attract snakes.
Oh, yes.
And that's something probably most people probably don't want gardener snakes or any sort of snake in their lawn or on their property. But frankly, that's kind of silly, especially in Connecticut or in the East Coast, where we don't really have high populations of poisonous snakes. We mostly have snakes that are beneficial to the landscape.
Yes.
And obviously that's different for someone who's like in Arizona. The most pressure that I have in my property is from voles or from small rodents. The property borders wetlands, which ideally is like the best place to have predators of small rodents, but it's because, that's the place where owls and lots of red-tailed hawks and other sorts of predatory birds like to hang out. But they like to hang out there because there's a high population of rodents and voles and moles and things you don't necessarily want in your garden. Luckily, I don't have gophers, groundhogs? Yeah, groundhogs. Point being is that inviting snakes onto your property with rock piles is something that, you might never think of doing, but will benefit you in the long run if you have intense vole pressure, which lots of people on the East Coast do. especially in New England. This past year was one of the worst years for voles. I know several big time nurseries that just had entire crop loss because of voles,
Oh
or
man.
had trees girdled and all sorts of horrible things. Yeah, I don't know if you might not have voles down there, but it's bad. It's not as bad as having wild boar, but but it's still not great.
Sure.
The other thing to sort of add on to what you were saying, I saw Sean Dombrowski of Edible Acres post a video a few weeks ago in like early April, and he's in Zone 5 in the Finger Lakes region of New York, and he has some apricot trees that he planted at his folks' property like 10 years ago that were blooming super early, as apricots tend to do. And frequently in New England, it's pretty hard to grow things like apricots, or I think also almonds. Almonds are also early bloomers, maybe. Could be wrong. But basically, because they bloom so early, and then you'll get like a 20-degree night that just kills all the flowers. But even if that happens, it's really, really helpful for the bee population of your property to have that week or two, or even a few days of the apricot tree flowering when no other trees are flowering. On my property, I have 2 satin plumcot trees, which is a hybrid of plums and apricots.
That's amazing.
And they bloomed considerably earlier than any of the other stone fruit, by probably like a week, maybe 2 weeks. And in other places in colder climates, perhaps it could be longer. I'm not entirely sure. And another thing, that there are a number of late bloomers I have on my property. I want to say cardinal flower, and also are sunchokes. Do sunchokes stay in bloom longer than others, or am I making that up?
Yeah, they're fairly late. Same thing with the Maximilian sunflower, the perennial sunflower, blooms kind of like mid to late summer.
Yeah, and so when a lot of things are no longer creating nectar sources, they'll out. And I have 2 Santa Fe Maximilian sunflowers, now that because you mentioned it, and I have no idea where to put them, because they, just like sunchokes, are apparently impossible to remove. And I don't. They like dry, sunny spots.
The north side
which
of
I
a
don't have
barn.
very many of. Yeah, no, I need another barn, I guess. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on, this is the last note I had, was basically to anybody who's starting out, the idea that you need to do things really slow, and you need to maybe spend a whole year looking at the property, watching the sun, watching the areas of your lawn that are really, really loaded with sun in April, but are shady at other times of the year, like we talked about, or areas that get really, really wet in the spring, but then dry out in the summer. That's an area that, is kind of hard to deal with. Other areas that, you might think, it's when you buy a plant at a nursery, it says full sun. Okay, well, this area is 6 to 8 hours of sun. You can just plop it there. Well, it's better to spend a year learning the site and learning where the rainfall goes, the runoff, all of the different aspects of the site before you start putting things in certain positions. Because even if you get something that does like full sun, those plant labels at your local nursery don't really have every little detail about the plant. I always recommend to people going to PFAF or PFAF,
Sure.
Plants for a Future, and checking out the detailed cultivation recommendations for any plant that you're trying to cultivate, because what's on there will just vastly outperform your little label that you get with the plant. Let's say that you notice a place in your yard that has full sun and you want to plant something there. It might not like it there. If you're planting blueberries, they're usually pretty picky about soil acidity, and that's something you might not have considered. If you're planting something that isn't drought tolerant, and you're just so happen to be like, you moved into a new house and it's early summer in June, and you plant something, well, in August, that area might be really, really, really dry, and you don't know that yet. So the whole idea of just kind of taking in all of the information of the site for a full year, taking notes, because you're not going to remember it all. And anything that really stands out to you, that's something you should be writing down. Like, this area is really wet, like only in the month of April, but then the rest of the year it's fine. Mm-hmm. That's something you should write down. Furthermore, going back to permaculture, the whole idea of zones and designing your landscape, you start with zone 0, which is basically your house or everything right around your house. And then you go to zone 1, which is like your herb garden. Zone 2 is the area just a little bit farther out in your landscape where you have things planted that you're going to visit less during the year and spend less energy traveling to and from your house to get. Maybe that's where you plant rhubarb, because you only going to harvest rhubarb a few times a year. But the things that you're going to harvest 10 or 100 times a year, you want to have really close to your house. Lots of people put their garden kind of off in a corner of their property because they think it's ugly, or they think people aren't going to want to see it or whatever. And that's just stupid. You should put it as close to your house as you can, so that it's still aesthetically pleasing. I mean, you can make it as beautiful as you want, so that's functional, and that when you're cooking and you're in your kitchen, you can step right outside, go to your herb garden, get your tomato, whatever you need. It's right there. That's ideal. Having to walk even 15 feet, 30 feet is less ideal. 100 feet is definitely not ideal at all. And I feel like most places, most homes have that sort of long commute to the garden, which is like the classic way that we think about where the garden should go. So think about the plants that you want to cultivate the most and you want to eat the most, and put them right up against your house.
Yeah, it seems like one of those like no duh situations, but time and time again, you see people designing their gardens much further away than they should. And even if it is the perfect site, if that perfect site is, 150 feet away from your house, you're not going to visit it as often. And there's something to that. Like if you walk by something every single day, when you walk in and out, you're going to maybe pick a bug off of it. You might water it. You might check in on it. And I think there's something to that. I think they'll be a lot healthier for it.
I mean, it's just that idea of neglect. If you have plants that you don't want to neglect, put them in your walking path. But yeah, dude, this was awesome. I feel like my brain is tingling.
Same. And I think for people listening, like I was going to say, we should wrap this up with a summary of what they should expect from more episodes. And I think it's just going to be more like this, just jam-packed information on all topics related to gardening, plants, ecology, food production, food preparation, all the things that you and I love. And it's fun to share it with someone else. And I knew we were going to be working on something together when we first started chatting over text, over Instagram, but I didn't know what it was. So I'm glad it's materialized.
Yeah, no, me too. And one thing that I hope that we really kind of get into is the culinary side of things, because I'm growing all these plants, but do I know how to eat them? Kind of. I have ramps and they're good, but like I hope that there's people out there who can shed some knowledge to us also about some of the things that we're so very interested in. But just basically having the conversations are so important. Having conversations with people, even when it's things that you know about, you're always going to learn something new. I learned so many new things today just from this conversation. And the fact that we're recording it, it's like I can always go back and listen to it again if I forget it. It's incredible. I love podcasts.
Yeah, me too. Glad we're doing this.